Movie tickets used to cost $5. Now they cost $20. And theaters wonder why nobody shows up. There's a moment now when you go to the movies that didn't used to exist. It's not when the lights dim or the trailers start. It's when you look at the ticket price and feel that tiny jolt of disbelief. It's the moment you realize that something that used to be casual, spontaneous, almost thoughtless, has quietly turned into a luxury product. And it didn't happen because movies got better. It happened because the industry forgot who it was supposed to serve. The movies used to be the most democratic art form in America. The place where anyone could walk in, sit down, and disappear into a story for a couple of hours without worrying about their bank account. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Somewhere along the way, the movies stopped being for everyone. About 10 years ago, all the way back in 2016, Quentin Tarantino argued that movie tickets should cost no more than $5. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was a callback to a time when tickets really were that cheap. In the 1970s and 80s, when Tarantino was growing up, the average movie ticket price was actually lower than $5. Tarantino often reflects on this era, emphasizing that affordable tickets weren't just a price point, they were a philosophy. They made moviegoing a habit, not an event. You could go because you were bored, because your friends were going, or simply because the poster looked cool. You didn't have to plan it or justify it, and habits matter. Habits are what keep industries alive. But then you look at AMC, and you see what happens when a company forgets that it's in the habit business. AMC's attendance has been declining for years, and instead of asking why people stopped coming, AMC responded by raising prices, and then raising them again, and then raising them again. They introduced surcharges for preferred seating. They inflated concession prices to the point where a popcorn and soda cost more than the ticket itself. They turned the movie theater into an airport terminal, a place where everything feels like a trap designed to extract money from you. And then, just when you think they've run out of ways to nickel and dime people, AMC announces something so absurd it feels like satire. They're blocking off the best seats in the auditorium and reserving them exclusively for A-list and Stubs Premier members. Not better projection, not better sound, not better service, just a velvet rope around the middle rows. It's a revival of the failed Sightline experiment, the one everyone hated, except now it's not just about price, it's about status. It's AMC saying, if you don't pay us monthly, you don't deserve the good seats. And they're doing this while attendance is down, revenue is falling, and customers are already fed up with surcharges. It's the purest example of a company that knows the price of a seat, but not the value of a customer. But the real reason AMC keeps doing this isn't because it works. It's because they're trapped in a system that demands perpetual growth. Public companies have to show revenue increases every quarter, even when the underlying business is shrinking. AMC can't build more theaters. They can't add more screens. They can't magically increase attendance. So the only lever they have left is price. And so they pull it over and over and over and over again. Not because it's smart, but because the spreadsheet demands it. And this is where the old adage comes in. The one that applies to every business that mistakes extraction for strategy. You can shear a sheep 100 times, but you can only skin it once. AMC thinks it's shearing the sheep, but it's not. It's skinning it. They're extracting so much value from the remaining audience that the audience eventually disappears. And once you've skinned the sheep, there's nothing left to shear. That's why attendance keeps falling even as prices rise. AMC isn't building a future, it's cannibalizing one. The irony is that the prices have gone so high that AMC's revenue is now declining. People don't like being nickeled and dimed. People who can afford it don't like feeling they're being treated as a revenue extraction point instead of a human being. And this is where the Netflix comparison becomes useful, because Netflix is the only company in the entertainment world that can raise prices twice a year and not immediately lose half its audience. Netflix is the default. Netflix is the habit. Netflix is the one service people feel they must have. But I will say this, even Netflix has a ceiling. Every company does, every service does. There is no such thing as infinite price elasticity. At some point, the price gets high enough that people start doing the math and they realize that piracy, which has always been a value calculation, not a moral one, is suddenly worth the risk again. If even Netflix has limits, AMC never stood a chance. And this isn't just a movie theater problem. We've seen this exact same pattern play out in restaurants and fast casual chains. Jamba Juice priced itself so high that people realized they could make 5 smoothies at home for the price of 1. McDonald's raised prices so aggressively that customers start ordering only 1 McDouble or 1 McChicken. The drive-thru lines looked long, but the receipts were tiny. McDonald's had to lower prices because the illusion of demand hid the collapse of volume. And movie theaters used to operate the same way. Cheap tickets filled seats. Full seats sold concessions. Concessions made money. But when theaters raised ticket prices, volume collapsed. When they raised concession prices, people started sneaking in food. And the ushers, paid so little that they had no incentive to enforce the rules, stopped caring. People walk in with McDonald's bags and KFC buckets in plain sight, and nobody stops them. Hell, I've seen people walk in with like Little Caesars hot and ready pizzas right in front of the usher, and the usher doesn't do a goddamn thing about it. It's the Doorman Fallacy in real time. When you underpay the people who protect the experience stops being protected. But here's the part the industry refuses to acknowledge. Even if theaters lowered prices tomorrow, some people are never coming back. COVID didn't just close theaters, it broke the movie-going habit. For decades, going to the movies was a ritual, a weekly outing, a date night default, a boredom cure, a spontaneous decision. When theaters shut down, people replaced that habit with streaming, gaming, YouTube, TikTok, and home theaters. And once a habit is broken, it's incredibly hard to rebuild. But instead of lowering prices to lure people back, theaters raised them to the highest levels in history. High prices didn't just fail to rebuild the habit, they cemented its disappearance. Theaters didn't just lose customers, they lost behavioral momentum. Meanwhile, Europe did something the United States never even considered. They protected their movie theaters as cultural institutions. They subsidized them. They treated them like museums, libraries, and concert halls. Not just businesses, but public goods. And when COVID hit, Europe's theaters bounced back faster because they had a safety net. The United States lost around 2,000 movie screens because we treat cinema as disposable. Oscar Wilde once said, quote, "A cynic is a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing," end quote. Europe knows the value of cinemas. America knows the price. And if you want to understand how far we've drifted from the idea of moviegoing as a communal experience, you have to look at the drive-in. Drive-ins weren't just theaters. They were social spaces. They were hangouts. They were places where people talked, flirted, laughed, ate, and occasionally watched the movie. They were chaotic and communal and imperfect in all the ways that made them magical. And the culture remembers this. Bob's Burgers did an entire episode about saving a drive-in, and it captures the whole emotional contradiction perfectly. Bob sneaks off with the girl to watch the movie from the top of the drive-in sign, not because the radios weren't working, but because he wanted to be with her. They end up riffing on the movie because without turning the car radio to the right frequency, there's no sound at all. That's how drive-ins work. Half the experience is the movie. The other half is the improvisation you do with the people you're with. And the episode nails the cultural rituals too. There's an old couple trying to sneak someone in the drive-in by stuffing him in the trunk, a time-honored tradition, only for the trunk to jam shut with the person still inside. It's funny because it's true. That was the drive-in vibe. Chaotic, communal, a little bit stupid, and completely charming. But the emotional gut punch comes later. Bob starts a petition to quote-unquote save the drive-in, convinced he's fighting for something important, only to learn the owner wants to sell the land so she can finally retire. She's not the villain, she's tired. And that's when she asks Bob the question that cuts right through all the nostalgia. When was the last time you came here before tonight? And Bob can't answer, because that's the truth underneath the sentimentality. People love the idea of drive-ins more than they actually showed up for them. Drive-ins didn't just die because audiences left. They died because drive-ins changed. They stopped being cheap, they tried to become multiplexes, they subdivided their land, added more screens, shrank the projection services, and turned themselves into worse versions of indoor theaters. They forgot they could make money without movies. Through festivals, flea markets, car shows, concerts, food truck rallies, they abandoned the identity that made them special. And once they became a worse version of the multiplex won. And here's the irony. During COVID, drive-ins made a brief comeback. People drove up to empty fields, fairgrounds, even Walmart parking lots just to watch a movie on a big screen again. It wasn't about the film. It was about safety, distance, nostalgia, community, the feeling of going out without going inside. It proved people still crave communal viewing when the conditions are right, but theaters learned nothing from this moment. COVID broke the habit, and high prices kept it broken. Which brings us to the Doorman Fallacy, because the modern movie theater experience is defined by the absence of the people who used to protect it. Theaters used to have ushers, they used to have staff who enforced the rules, kept the environment respectful, and made the experience feel curated. But when theaters cut labor to save money, they cut the very thing that made the experience worth paying for. Now you walk into a theater and it feels like no one's in charge. People talk, people text, people record, people bring in outside food, and the staff, underpaid, overworked, and undertrained, have no incentive to intervene. Theaters save money, and in doing so, they destroyed the product. Oscar Wilde's line lands again. They knew the price of labor, but not the value of it. Alamo Drafthouse is the exception that proves the rule. They enforce the rules, they invest in staff, they treat the moviegoing experience as sacred, and audiences reward them for it. Because value beats price. Because people will pay for an experience that feels intentional. Because the problem isn't that movie theaters are too expensive. The problem is that they're too expensive for what they offer. And once you understand how the experience broke, you start to understand how the culture broke with it. Because when ticket prices rise, people stop taking risks. They stop experimenting. They stop wandering into a movie just because the poster looked cool or because they had 2 hours to kill. They stop giving smaller films a chance. They stop trusting the theater as a place of discovery. When a ticket costs $20, you're not going to roll the dice on a quirky indie or mid-budget drama. You're going to choose the safest possible option. The sequel, the reboot, the superhero movie, the thing you already know you'll like. And that's how we ended up in a world where the only movies that can justify their existence are the ones that already have a built-in audience. There was a time when movies like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Sideways, Little Miss Sunshine, The Holdovers, or anything Wes Anderson made could thrive in theaters. They weren't blockbusters. They weren't 4-quadrant tentpoles. They were movies for adults, movies for weirdos, movies for people who wanted something different. And they succeeded because the barrier to entry was low. You could take a chance on a movie like that because the cost of being wrong wasn't catastrophic. But now the cost of being wrong is the cost of a nice dinner. And so people don't take chances anymore. They wait for streaming. They wait for word of mouth. They wait for the algorithm to tell them what to watch. And the theaters lose another piece of their soul. But the real cultural shift, the one no one in the industry wants to talk about, is that movies don't feel as big as they used to. Not because the movies are worse, but because the volume collapsed. When Jurassic Park crossed $1 billion in 1993, possibly into early 1994, it felt like a once-in-a-generation achievement. Tickets were cheap. You had to sell a fuck ton of them to hit that milestone. And here's the part people forget. In the entire decade of the 90s, only 3 movies crossed $1 billion worldwide. Jurassic Park, which was the first to do it unadjusted for inflation in 1993, Titanic in 1997, and 1999 Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace. That was it. 3 movies across an entire decade, and each one felt like a cultural earthquake because they earned those numbers through sheer human turnout. Titanic wasn't just a hit, it was a global event. It was the biggest movie in the world at the time, unadjusted for inflation. And if you do adjust for inflation, Gone with the Wind is still the highest grossing movie ever made because it sold more tickets than anything in modern history. But nothing captures the cultural skill of that era better than The Phantom Menace. When Episode 1 came out in 1999, there were news stories of fans camping outside theaters for 3 weeks just to be the first inside. People literally lived on sidewalks. They brought tents, coolers, sleeping bags, portable TVs, card games. Entire micro-communities formed outside multiplexes. That wasn't marketing. That wasn't FOMO. That was cultural gravity. And in the 2020s, that would never happen. Not because the movies are worse, but because the habit is gone. The ritual is gone and the volume is gone. Starting in the 2010s, ticket prices crept higher and higher. And suddenly, hitting $1 billion didn't require the same number of people. You didn't need the same cultural footprint. You didn't need the same universal reach. $1 billion in the 2010s and 2020s simply does not mean what $1 billion meant in the 90s. If you want a modern example of how the cultural footprint has shrunk, look at Avatar. In 2009, Avatar became the highest grossing movie ever made. It beat Titanic. It dominated the global box office, and then it vanished. Avatar came, made its money, and disappeared from the cultural conversation almost instantly. No iconic quotes, no iconic characters, no lasting cultural footprint. And the same thing happened with its sequel, The Way of Water. It made a staggering amount of money, one of the highest grossing films of all time, and then evaporated from the zeitgeist. These movies made history financially, but not culturally, because the milestone got cheaper, the achievement got smaller, the movies felt smaller. A movie today can hit $1 billion without ever feeling like a phenomenon, because the phenomenon wasn't the money, it was the number of people, and the number of people collapsed. And this is where the Las Vegas analogy comes in, because Vegas used to operate on the same principle that made movie theaters work. Vegas used to be cheap. The hotels were cheap, the food was cheap, the drinks were cheap, the shows were cheap. Everything was subsidized by the casinos because the casinos knew that once you were inside, you'd spend money. Vegas wasn't selling luxury, Vegas was selling possibility. But then the casinos got greedy. They raised prices, they added resort fees, they charged for parking, they nickel and dimed the very people who made the city thrive. And this is where the adage hits even harder. You can shear a sheep 100 times, but you can only skin it once. Vegas used to shear the sheep, offer cheap entry, make money on volume. Now it skins the sheep, extract as much as possible from fewer and fewer visitors. And once you skin the sheep, there's nothing left to shear. Movie theaters are doing the exact same thing. They're charging premium prices for a product that used to be accessible. They're treating the audience like a revenue stream instead of a community. They're forgetting that the entire business model was built on volume, not exclusivity. And while all of this is happening, the home theater revolution has quietly become unstoppable. People have 4K TVs, soundbars, blackout curtains, and streaming libraries that update every week. People can pause the movie, people can eat whenever they want, people can talk, rewind, take breaks, and watch at their own pace. And the truth is, the gap between the theatrical experience and the home experience has never been smaller. But the real cultural consequence isn't technological, it's psychological. Because when people stop going to the movies, they stop having shared cultural moments. They stop having the experience of sitting in a room full of strangers and laughing at the same joke or gasping at the same twist. They stop having the communal rituals that make movies feel larger than life. And in that vacuum, the algorithm steps in. The algorithm doesn't care about community. The algorithm doesn't care about engagement. The algorithm feeds you what it thinks you'll click on, not what will challenge you or surprise you or make you feel connected to something bigger than yourself. And this is where the culture war cynics enter the picture, because there's a whole contingent of people who actively root for Hollywood to fail. They believe the industry was hijacked by a political agenda, and they see every box office disappointment as proof that audiences are rejecting something ideological. And look, the industry is not immune from criticism. There was a stretch in the 2010s where certain themes were delivered with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer through a glass table. But the problem is that this group now sees every movie through that lens, even when the critique doesn't make sense. Take Mad Max Fury Road. When it came out, people said it was a feminist power fantasy. They said Max got sidelined, they said Furiosa took over the movie, and here's the twist. They're right. Fury Road is absolutely a feminist power fantasy. George Miller has said as much. But the part they miss is the franchise context. Mad Max started as a tiny, scrappy Australian indie. The Road Warrior is the movie that made the franchise iconic, and in that movie, just like in the original, Max isn't the protagonist. Max is a wanderer. Max is a Ronin. Max is a catalyst. He shows up, helps the community, and leaves. That's the formula. That's the DNA. Beyond Thunderdome is the one that went Hollywood, and fans hated it for that reason. But even the bad Mad Max movie left a cultural crater. The Thunderdome became a metaphor for chaos. 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. Became a meme. And during COVID, WWE literally named their virtual arena the Thunderdome, complete with LED screens simulating a crowd. So when people say Fury Road isn't a real Mad Max movie, what they're really saying is that they don't understand the franchise they're critiquing. They're reacting to vibes, not history. And that's the danger of culture war cynicism. It distracts from the real structural problems. It turns every conversation about cinema into a referendum on ideology instead of economics. It makes people root for the industry to fail instead of demanding that it do better. And you can't fix the film industry if you're rooting for it to die. But the solution isn't complicated. It's not easy, but it's not complicated. The solution is to make movie tickets cheap again. Not discounted, not dynamic, not premium, cheap, affordable, accessible. Theaters need to return to the volume model that made them successful in the first place. They need to stop chasing luxury margins and start chasing full auditoriums. They need to stop treating the audience like a revenue stream and start treating them like a community. They need to invest in staff. They need to enforce the rules. They need to make the experience feel intentional again. Because the truth is, people still love the movies. People still want to go to the movies. People still crave the communal experience of sitting in the dark with strangers and being transported somewhere else. But they don't want to feel exploited. They don't want to feel like they're being charged for breathing. They don't want to feel like the theater is daring them to stay home. And right now, that's exactly how it feels. If theaters made tickets cheap again, everything else would follow. Attendance would rise, concession sales would rise, word of mouth would rise, mid-budget films would have a fighting chance, theaters would become social spaces again instead of transactional ones, and the culture would regain something it has quietly lost. The sense that movies are for everyone, not just the people who can afford to treat them like a luxury. Theaters forgot the one thing that made them successful: being affordable and being fun. And until they remember that, the decline will continue. But the moment they do, the moment they stop chasing the illusion of luxury and return to the reality of community, the moment they stop skinning the sheep and going back to shearing it, that's the moment the movies come back to life. Because the movies were never about the price, they were about the value. And the value was never in the ticket. The value was in the experience. The shared laughter, the shared gasps, the shared silence, the shared escape. The value was in the people. It always was. And if the industry can remember that, even for a moment, everything else will fall back into place.